Here's the scenario. The year is 2032 and the US is in a protracted war with China after an invasion of Taiwan. Neither side has a significant edge. After many weeks of intense fighting, when both sides have suffered heavy damage and are running low on precision missiles and other conventional weapons, China pulls the trigger and decides to use tactical nuclear weapons to strike a decisive blow by hitting critical US targets, including Guam and other American bases in the Indo-Pacific, as well as aircraft carrier strike groups. The pendulum has now swung heavily in the favor of the PLA. Does this sound far-fetched? After all, we've all constantly heard about the nuclear taboo and how it would inevitably result in mutually assured destruction for both sides and the end of the world. But that's Cold War I thinking. A war with the Soviet Union in Europe isn't the same as one in the 21st century with China in the Indo-Pacific theater. According to a defense think tank, American leaders and military strategists are still in a, quote, Cold War hangover, and anchored to outdated thought patterns and models that are tied to US-Soviet competition. The Center for a New American Security, CNAS, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank focused on the future of the U.S. military and a potential conflict with China, recently published a new report after conducting tabletop exercises, a type of war game, with a group of experts. CNAS concluded that its 2032 scenario was not far-fetched at all. In fact, they concluded that the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons in an Indo-Pacific war with China has a, quote, uncomfortable yet plausible logic. As the authors put it, quote, unfortunately, strategies of asymmetric coercive escalation for war control and potentially termination represent a plausible future. End quote. First, a word about tactical nukes, which are also called non-strategic nuclear weapons. They're essentially smaller, lower-yield versions of strategic nukes that are designed to take out military targets instead of entire cities. So why would tactical nukes be more likely to be used in a US versus China war? One big difference is geography. During the First Cold War, the US and Soviets strategized how to use tactical nukes in a land war in Europe to take out large troop formations, usually in or near civilian populations. But in an Indo-Pacific war, a largely maritime conflict with lots of archipelagos, China would have an advantage because of a, quote, asymmetry of targets, and be more tempted to break the nuclear taboo as the war dragged on. China would have a wide range of attractive American targets, from military bases, islands, naval assets, and air bases on Allied territory. Beijing would have a greater incentive and be more tempted to use a small number of tactical nukes on these high-value targets because they would result in minimal civilian casualties and thus less risk of nuclear escalation. But it's a different story on the American side. As the CNAS put it, quote, the United States force posture is distributed across sea, Allied territory, non-contiguous U.S. territories, non-contiguous states, and the continental United States. Outside of the invasion force, most of China's most important military targets are located on the Chinese mainland. This fundamental asymmetry provides China with more graduated options than the United States to strike important military targets while avoiding the U.S. homeland. Even worse, the wargamers found out that the U.S. military ran out of its most advanced non-nuclear conventional missiles around day 45 of the war and did not have the proper weapons to take out even the, quote, very small number of lower-risk Chinese targets, like its bases on disputed reefs in the South China Sea. Another difference is the evolution of nuclear and conventional weapons. Most people view any violation of the nuclear taboo as hugely escalatory, but the authors of the report point out that that's not necessarily the case. Today's tactical nukes can be delivered with precision with less collateral damage. According to the CNAS, quote, the line between low-yield tactical nuclear weapons and precision-guided conventional weapons in terms of both their operational effects and perceived impact is blurring, end quote. The report points to a third factor why tactical nukes would be more tempting to deploy. In a long, protracted conflict, both the US and China would start to run low on conventional munitions like precision-guided bombs. Tactical nukes, which don't have to be as precise as conventional weapons, are efficient at causing immediate and long-lasting damage to a large-scale target. For example, hitting an airfield over and over with conventional weapons makes sense when the quiver is full. But once the magazine starts to run low, and both sides have suffered extensive damage to command and control platforms and other key assets, it makes it much more tempting to take out a high-value target like an American base in Japan or the Philippines, which could shift the balance of the war. But wait, what about China's so-called, quote, no first use policy, which pledges to never use nukes first, but only as a retaliatory strike for deterrence? But can we really just hope that Xi Jinping and the CCP abides to the honor system and stand by this pledge? The CNAS pointed out that China's no first use policy, coupled with their relatively small number of nukes compared to the US, is the reason why American strategists have spent so little time studying and wargaming these scenarios out. The report also points out that, quote, over the past 5 years, it has been clear that the PRC is dramatically expanding both the quantity and quality of its strategic nuclear forces. Most dramatically, construction of over 300 hardened intercontinental ballistic missile silos. The 2023 China Military Power Report suggests that the PRC will have 1,000 operational warheads by 2030. As recently as 2020, the U.S. Department of Defense estimated the PRC's operational stockpile was in the low 200s and claimed that it grew to 500 warheads in 2023. PRC leadership has clearly decided on markedly increasing their nuclear capabilities, but has failed to explain the overarching strategic rationale for this expansion, end quote. To underscore the point, here's an article from October of 2023 by a London-based defense think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, which pointed out that when China released its new proposal for a new global order, it significantly dropped any mention of its 1964 no first use policy, which could mark a deliberate new shift in policy. The author wonders if, quote, China may have learned from Moscow's capitalization on European fear regarding Russian nuclear weapons use. If there's any good news from the CNAS report, it's that even if tactical nukes were used in an American-Chinese war, the wargamers found out that, in contrast to expectations of how a US-Soviet war would play out, things didn't necessarily spiral out of control into a full-blown end-of-world scenario. They pointed to two factors that help keep things limited to tactical nukes. First, quote, red lines drawn within the nuclear bargaining domain are continually revised, with protraction creating more time for such revisions to occur, end quote. And secondly, quote, despite continuous bargaining over acceptable forms of combat and targets, violating the nuclear taboo does not appear to license additional uses, as each subsequent use carries with it unique risks, end quote. The authors of the report readily admit that there are so many wildcards and unpredictable factors involved that it's impossible to safely make any accurate predictions. At the end of the day, it comes down to the judgment of the leaders calling the shots, and that, the authors concede, quote, remains the fundamental unknowable component, end quote. To wrap up, here are the CNAS's top-line recommendations to American policymakers and military strategists. Number 1, educate senior U.S. decision-makers on the troubling logic of theater nuclear use and corresponding limits on U.S. responses. Number 2, pursue dialogue and confidence-building measures where possible with the PRC, even when there is a perception of limited movement. Number 3, hold detailed planning conversations with Japan and Australia on responses to nuclear use. Number 4, fully integrate nuclear activities into U.S. planning and exercises, not just as a last day or standalone exercise. Number 5, develop and exercise operational concepts for visible theater nuclear generation. Number 6, improve both the capabilities and capacities of conventional munitions. And number 7, considered expanded theater nuclear weapons capabilities. The report concludes with this, quote, any study on emerging nuclear dynamics in today's world is likely to be disquieting. This effort is no different. The authors want to reiterate that this world does not yet exist and may not come to pass. However, it must be actively deterred. Doing so requires proactive steps by the United States, continued engagement with the PRC, and ultimately an increased acceptance of risk by U.S. leadership commensurate with the challenges of deterrence at the strategic and theater levels, end quote. To understand this at a deeper level, here are some highlights from a live stream that the CNAS did that accompanied the release of their report, with the lead author Andrew Metrick and CNAS's Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, who hosted Dr. Justin Anderson, a senior policy fellow at National Defense University's Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction.
I think we want to step back and try to understand what's going on because China hasn't actually said a lot officially about their nuclear modernization, unlike their conventional one. Justin, what do you see as the most important elements of China's nuclear modernization? Do you think it's the number of warheads, which have gotten a lot of attention in the DoD reports, the new delivery systems? What sort of strikes you as being really significant?
So it's a good question, Stacy. I mean, I am tempted to say it's all the above. It's all concerning. But let me go a little deeper and say, while the overall number of warheads is very concerning and something that you have to track quite closely, I think from my own perspective and the work that I do, it's important to also focus on the diversity of delivery systems. So there's lots of reasons why overall volume of arsenal is something that does need to be focused on. But and a concern I also have is to look at, this is now an arsenal that has both what we often label as strategic systems. So there's the long-range systems. You think of a strategic triad, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Also now China's Air Force, again, has a nuclear role with some of its bombers. But at the same time, you also have systems that are dual-capable theater range systems. And I think it's important, this is an important thing the report calls out and was an important part of your tabletop exercises. These systems are different. Their role is quite uncertain. Very little is said about them by the Chinese. And these are the types of systems that are probably going to be most relevant in an operational sense. They're all important, but in an operational sense, these are the systems that I think would be quite concerning within something like a regional conflict.
I agree with Justin. It's very good to point out the differences in the capabilities of the systems that the Chinese are developing. I think one of the other things I want to highlight around that systems development piece that I think is most concerning from a U.S. perspective is the diversity of strategic launch systems that are being developed. So Dr. Vipin Narang, in his earlier work before he joined the administration, has this concept of different nuclear postures that enable different concepts for how you do nuclear operations. And one of the things that if you were interested in sort of a more limited approach that historically the Chinese have espoused in terms of the way that their writings have talked about nuclear arms, you would end up with a nuclear posture that looked like what they had 10 to 15 years ago. The systems that they're developing today, silo-based, things that have a degree of promptness, more advanced SSBNs, all of those systems, you can use that with a doctrine like the Chinese have traditionally espoused. However, it enables a whole different set of nuclear warfighting approaches that appear not to be in line with some of the no first use stuff that they've come out and talked about. So I think that, to put a little bit more of a fine point on Justin, some of the stuff that you were talking about, I think that's really the concern, is the uncertainty surrounding not just the bean counting of the systems, but the breadth of operational concepts and not necessarily operational concepts from an operational level of war perspective, but operational concepts from a strategic nuclear warfighting perspective that they enable. But to dive back to sort of that sort of operational piece of it, I think the uncertainty around their theater systems, the one that everyone sort of talks about is hot swap DF-26. There's very little, I think there's like one line in the China Military Power Report that DoD publishes each year that sort of talks about this. So again, there's tremendous uncertainty surrounding it. But when you're confronted with that uncertainty, one of the things that you can go do is you can start looking at Chinese writings about conventional warfighting. And you see things in there that if you hold them up to the light and pass through that, you can see at a sort of theorist level, you could see why some of these theater range weapons would be very appealing and fit neatly within a conventional theory of warfighting that really stresses long-range strike, that stresses systems destruction warfare and the removal of key nodes off the battlefield. And in that context, theater nuclear arms appear to be, I'm using a lot of, kind of weaselly words because we're out in the future, appear to be highly efficacious and potentially advantageous when viewed through that lens.
But let me speak a little bit more broadly to the range of engagements and say a couple things I would observe. One is that I think in the Chinese system, it takes a while for changes in policy and doctrine and strategy to appear, if they're going to appear at all, in public-facing documents. And I think part of what is going on is that China is building a lot because it can, and is perhaps itself still working out some of the full implications of what it means to have the capabilities now available to it. And I think there's probably a process of working through exactly what that is going to mean for its strategy and doctrine into the future. At the same time, the Chinese interlocutors wouldn't themselves say this directly, but I also feel that it's no surprise that China and with its present leadership and Xi and just the perspective that he seems to have on what does it mean to be a major power, that there has been a conclusion that a major power nuclear force, kind of like what the Russians and the Americans have, is something that he's decided to move forward with. So in terms of how this fits into a broader approach to nationalism and competition, I don't think there's any sort of surprises there. I think the one other thing that I would say is that it does seem to me, and I'm speaking broadly across a number of different engagements, not just myself, but other scholars have had with Chinese interlocutors, that there was, not even that long ago, a general denial that a buildup was going on. I don't think we'll ever get something like a confirmation, but there seems to be less certainty or vociferousness in denying that a buildup is going on now. So that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a lot of detail, but I think it does mean that they are moving to a different place in terms of their level of comfort in talking about nuclear things that is worth noting, and I think will become more important into the future.
And I want to follow up sort of on some of the NFU pieces that you sort of teased out there, because I think it's really important when you talked about the nationalism piece of this and sort of China's belief that to be a great power, it must possess certain of these capabilities, because that's something, to be a bit of a history nerd for a second, that you've seen before inside Chinese strategic culture. And in the late 60s and 70s, they're developing an SSBN. And lots of Western analysts would look at that and say, in the middle of this period of great turmoil within China, why are you developing an SSBN? Because there's some degree of national prestige associated with that. And there is a line of Western strategic analysts, which I might consider myself one of, who looks at the Chinese development of aircraft carriers and goes, why? And looks at that critically and says, if you believe things about a future missile-dominated combat regime, you might think that aircraft carriers don't represent the best, bang for your buck in that. But there are these prestige capabilities that are viewed as some part of the barrier to entry to being a great power. And so if you view some of this through that lens, there is an element of making sense. And I go back to Too often in this business, we look at things through the lens of there is a rational choice, and that rational choice exists in sort of a perfect world. But in this, you can really see how those rational choices are bounded and informed by a broad set of different features. And I think the nationalism point that you point out is really important to think about. That said, it does open up this, huge degree of uncertainty about the final destination. Once you build all this stuff, you do in fact need a doctrine that explains why it exists and what it does. So I think that at a fundamental level, like, we need to be reminded that deterrence is fundamentally a game of risks and costs against a backdrop of uncertainty, and you are trying to convince your adversary that the move that they're going to make is not actually going to pay off in the ways that they believe that it will. So like that, and it's fundamentally a human endeavor. The capabilities are important, and we can often, have very great discussions about the bean counting and system performance features. But ultimately, it is a game between people and the beliefs that they have at any certain time. And if you go back to any of the Cold War interactions between the U.S. and the USSR, those key facts sort of shine through time and time again. But I think that we can forget some those about the role that geography plays in determining, especially for the theater capabilities, the escalation pathways and nature of those escalatory dynamics play. So the one that we highlight in the report is the nature of fighting in an archipelagic theater. The most obvious one of those is that whilst any sort of nuclear detonation would be a monumental event, there appears to be a fundamental difference between detonating nuclear weapons over water than over land. There are different effects. There is a different potential for collateral damage. And if you believe that escalatory pressures are a result not just of the things that you mean to destroy, but the things that you destroy that you prefer potentially not to, especially in terms of civilian populations, you can start thinking about how very carefully targeted nuclear weapons have very limited amount of that effects and very specific tailored military effects. And that is really enabled by a more maritime theater, a theater where there might even be things that are on land, but they're distant from almost everything else, and they're military specific. So that, that's sort of the difference with the theater. And I think it's very difficult to talk about nuclear weapons today without talking about the precision revolution that occurred over the past 30 years. And while I have tremendous respect for the people who sort of developed that way of thinking, one of the problems with it is that when you go back and read the foundational documents around the RMA MTR period, it was really focused on conventional warfighting, and it stopped at the nuclear edge. And you could also make the same argument about a lot of folks on the nuclear side, as it stopped at that. And so that interface between the conventional and the nuclear, I think, is the place where, especially when we think about the Indo-Pacific in the future and the U.S.-China relationship in specifics, there's a lot of new ground that needs to be plowed in that space.
So Justin, do you think we're overblowing the differences? There is some truth to the idea deterrence is deterrence, or do you think there are important distinctions between the situation today and the Cold War?
Well, let me first observe that as I was reading the report last night, I was struck by, think back to the sort of Cold War lessons learned. It seemed that one of the biggest lessons many people learned was, gosh, I'm glad we never went to nuclear war, and I never want to think about this again. And I mention that because I think there are important, useful lessons to take from the Cold War era, but we should be very clear on the distinctions. And Andrew, I think, has made a couple important distinctions in that the nuclear dynamics of the Central European plane between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, are different than the nuclear dynamics you might have within a contemporary Indo-Pacific scenario. It doesn't mean it's not important to understand both. I think my larger concern, and one of the reasons I'm very happy to read this report, and there is some other, it's a small but I very much hope growing field of inquiry and literature, is to begin to actually unpack nuclear escalation dynamics in a contemporary sense. I hope taking some good lessons learned from the past, but also identifying where things are different today. And that's important because I think, unfortunately, too often nuclear escalation is sort of treated like this black box, that we can't understand it. because fortunately we don't have case studies, but nevertheless, you can't study it, you can't understand it, let's just try to avoid it. And I think the problem there is that unfortunately, I think sometimes leads to poor analysis and ends up taking all nuclear stuff sort of out of the equation, whether that's analyses or people are trying to do plans or things like that. And that just fundamentally can't fly anymore. I think it's transparently obvious that our adversaries are seeking to exploit concerns we and our allies have about things nuclear to try to gain an advantage, all the way from well before crisis to just trying to set the terms of discussion, debate, operational dynamics, everything. That's a problem. That's a problem for us right now. And if we're not doing detailed study, interesting analysis, doing things like tabletop exercises like this study does, unfortunately, I think we'll continue to fall into this trap of thinking this is just something we can't study, sort of can't handle, and we just kind of wish it would go away. It's not going away, and it's something that we really need to understand better moving forward.
I think when you go back and you look at Khan's work, it's very insightful and it's very helpful. I mean, I was reminded as I was writing the study that Khan does talk about escalation growing by leaps and bounds. So he definitely acknowledges the nonlinearity of the space. I think the problem oftentimes is less his actual writing and more the mental model that it sort of casts upon one. When you talk about a series of steps, it has an implied series of linearity. And the thing that I probably take the most umbrage from that sort of 44 steps is that, we transition from the conventional phase and then above it are all of these nuclear steps. And thinking about what advanced conventional warfare, or to use the other term, mature precision strike complex actually lets you do from a warfighting perspective. There are options on that conventional ladder that would be higher than nuclear options. The extreme example of which is, some things that have been talked about in international security about using conventional weapons to conduct, counterforce operations. And if you sort of had this you had an incredible conventional capability that could remove the entirety of your adversary's nuclear forces like that. That's a conventional warfighting tool that is clearly more escalatory than, say, a demonstration nuclear strike in the middle of nowhere, whether that be on your own country or on your test site in your own country or over the ocean in some place. So that's an extreme example to make a point. But the crossfade is really that what we're talking about is that the nuclear and conventional escalation paths aren't contiguous. They don't line up. They're two different processes going on. And the risks and pressures that they create in total will change your behavior or influence your behavior. And there's this odd zone that occurs within conflict. So the war is going on, and it's a high intensity conventional conflict between two nuclear powers. So it's this sort of place we've never been before from a global perspective, where the escalation risks are just deeply, deeply uncertain. And it's that uncertainty in this crossfade zone that I find particularly unnerving. So last year I wrote a report called Rolling the Iron Dice, which was looking at the prospects of conflict protraction in a U.S.-China conflict. And I came to the unsettling conclusion that they're growing for a variety of reasons, also related to this advanced precision warfare concept. And in that case, these nuclear risks sort of loomed as a thing to go look at. And I think, Justin, to your point, is like, this is the place that we should be looking. And it's not just in the places that we're talking about here, nuclear and conventional arms. There's the whole cyber, IO, EW spaces of this. That's yet another domain for us to be talking about creating these escalation risks. And when you go read things like the Science of Military Strategy on the Chinese side, they talk about IO and cyber having strategic deterrent effects greater than nuclear arms. It's in their talking, which is a very different way of thinking about it. So to your earlier point, that is someplace, that is sort of, I think, the direction that we should be marching from a intellectual study perspective, so that we can understand what is going on and potentially, and we can avoid that, the risks associated with that lack of knowledge.
Justin, I'm curious what your response is to this idea, whether you agree with the idea that there could be conventional attacks that are more escalatory than limited nuclear ones, and relatedly, whether you think China could find warfighting utility in using theater nuclear weapons in a conflict.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept, a compelling one. One note perhaps I'd have for the study, which is part of a series of studies, as you noted, Andrew, was to say, I think you can actually expand the concept further. It's just one area in which, and I know you're not saying this, but it's just one area in which there's a nuclear conventional interplay, overlap, complex dynamic that is worth studying further and all of us better understanding. Let me give just a pure hypothetical. And I'll even put it in the context of a tabletop exercise. Let's say you're running a tabletop exercise where there are two major powers, and some dispute arises within a region, but it's over a piece of territory that's not the homeland of either major power. This dispute becomes a crisis becomes a conflict. I think both teams would possibly reach a point where they would say, I have the option of imposing costs on the adversary by using conventional long-range strikes that will hit important things on their homeland that will impose costs. But I don't want to do that because now if I hit the homeland, I cause homeland casualties. I think they're going to be even more in than they are now. But there's this thing I want to do, this regional theater objective, and it's really important. And well, maybe I'll hit that with a nuclear, and then I bet the team would have this interesting internal debate of, is that theater nuclear employment against something that's in the region but not the homeland of my opponent? If I hit that with a nuclear weapon, is that actually less escalatory, sort of less problematic than the use of a conventional long-range strike that will hit their homeland? I think they'll probably have an interesting debate. I won't speculate as to how that debate is resolved, but I just give that as an example that I think is a good one, and I think highlights one of the important points of this nuclear conventional crossfade, which is there is this implicit assumption too many people have made for too long that the use of any nuclear weapon of any type anywhere would automatically push the the escalation button, and Stacy, you mentioned earlier, so the escalator then goes all the way to the top immediately. I think that's just a assumption that I think is flawed, and I think it's worth unpacking. And I think the nuclear conventional crossfade should at least make people ask questions. Actually, to go back to my tabletop exercise scenario, are there certain uses of non-nuclear things that indeed would be considered much more escalatory than something like this particular form of nuclear employment? And I think that's an important question that I wish more analysts would ask.
So I think a lot of the logics behind why teams or how teams thought about escalations were related to their beliefs about the payoffs of that escalation. So there was a perceptive payoff associated with that escalatory approach and so they're basically making that cost judgment. And so yes, versus the risk of sort of the escalating yet further. And this is a thing that you see across a variety of different games of people making those choices. But like why this is probably the greatest degree of uncertainty around any TTX design, not to nerd out on TTX design, but the way that people and players, both in TTX and players in a real world situation, view those risks and those payoffs are, we can TTX that to the cows come home, but you're going to have your sample size will be 1, and it's the time you roll into it. And that is very hard for us to understand. And that's one of the reasons why in the report we talk about, gambling for termination, of like, these are all fundamental gambles. And one of the reasons why protraction sort of at least appears to change those payoff curves is like getting out of a conflict appears something that a leader wants to do, but how the process by which that happens is like a giant question mark. And so that lack of a causal framework for achieving termination, in Fred Eichel's book, Every War Must End, it talks about like wars go on past when rational men conclude they must end, roughly paraphrasing him. It's that observation like turned up to 1,000, but how you get to that point, and nuclear arms might be the way to do that.
Was there difference? Did you see difference?
The only thing I'll say is that the dynamic within the teams, and I think this was set up well by the CNAS folks who put them together. I mean, you did have discussions internally where some would say, "Look, I've got this military objective, and I've got to meet it, and I've got to achieve it with whatever is available," versus others who were like, "Well, let's kind of think through some of the post-employment consequences." But over all of that, and this is noted in the report, and this is not making a new observation, but I think it's again salient. It's very important to think, do both sides or all sides have the same stakes in the outcome? Because if the stakes are different, that changes the way people think about the possible risks and costs of something like in theater, I'll put in quotes, limited nuclear employment.